Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Jakarta Tech Talk. My name is Serena, and joining us today is Reza Rahman, who will be presenting on the topic of a Freakonomic take on open standards and Jakarta EE. If you have any questions for Reza as we move through today's presentation, feel free to ask in the chat or use the Ask a Questions tab. Without any further delay, Reza, over to you.
All right, excellent. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my slides and make sure that's all right, and also get a confirmation for you that that's actually all right. So let me see. Go ahead and do that first. All right, and it's going to be like a mirror situation for just a tiny bit, but not too much. Let me close all this stuff out. Let me hide this thing here and start the presentation. I'll just switch my displays here.
Beautiful.
Alrighty, so
we see it.
Excellent. All right, so let's get rolling. So probably a lot of you know me already. My name is Reza Rahman. In my day job, I'm principal program manager at Java on Azure. Actually enabling a lot of the Jakarta EE runtimes and microprofile runtimes on Azure. But actually, this particular talk is not necessarily that much about my day job, at least not directly. I would say this is actually a talk more on behalf of the Jakarta EE ambassadors. And more of a community thing for me. And in fact, I'll explain sort of my motivations for this talk and what is it that I hope to cover in the next hour or so with you. Okay, at any rate, if you have any questions or want to talk about any of this or frankly anything related to Jakarta EE or microprofile or Azure or whatever strikes your fancy, one of the things I try to do this for is to connect with you also, slightly more personal level. So, all of my contact details are available. I'll share it at the very end, but at the very minimum, on the slide deck, you'll see my email address and my Twitter handle. You can reach out to me on those anytime. And by the way, in the chat, I've already shared the location of the slide deck. This location of the slide deck is like all of my other talks are on speaker deck, so you can take a look at those at any point in time. So, okay, with that, the other thing I'd like to remind, and I think Serena already mentioned this, but if you have a question or what have you, just use the chat or use the ask a question thing, and I'll stop every now and then. I'll pause a little bit and sort of let you ask questions and hopefully make this a little bit more interactive. Okay, all that aside, let's talk about what this talk is about, what's the motivation behind it, and what is it that I hope to cover in the next hour or so. So the title is a mouthful. Basically, this has to do a little bit about fundamentally the reasons why I've been involved in the open standards community and Jakarta EE in particular for a little while. And actually, one of the fundamental reasons why I think all this matters. Right? At the end of the day, you got to ask yourself, why are you doing the thing that you are doing? And especially when you're been involved in the community for as long as I have, there better be a good reason why. Right? That's important to you as to why you're doing this stuff. And actually, this is what this talk is really about at a foundational level. So hopefully, I get to convince you of the reasons that I think things like open standards and Jakarta EE, and to some extent, even things like microprofile actually matter and why they're important. Now, the other thing I'll tell you is one thing you may not know about me is actually I started my sort of academic career as an economist. Right? I mean, I was always into computers at an early age, but really computers wasn't the thing for me. It was actually economics for a while. And this particular talk actually is a hybrid of that. So in effect, what I'm going to be explaining to you is something that most decent, like 200 level, sort of economic students in a university should understand. Right? At least they should understand what is it that I'm talking about. And a lot of it is actually looking at Jakarta EE and open standards in particular from that economic lens. Now, Freakonomics is a bit of a spin-off from that. I'll explain Freakonomics in a bit. And hopefully, if you're in this talk, you already have figured out this is not a talk about just APIs and standards and here's a cool new thing that you need to do. But it's actually about ideas. So maybe you're the type of person that already knows what Freakonomics is, and maybe even that's the reason why you're in this talk, which is even better, right? Because it really helps me translate some of the fundamental motivations of this talk a lot easier. But I'll explain the Freakonomics bit a bit. Fundamentally, what I'm trying to do is explain to you in terms of a particular economic theory why things like open standards and Jakarta EE actually matter so much, especially to even to technical folks, right? Even if you don't, have not an economic bone in your body, looking at it from a Freakonomic perspective, you should understand why this actually matters to all of us, and fundamentally why it's important in the short and long run to any engineer's career journey in this particular space. All right, so without further ado, let me move forward. All right. So the best place to start is explaining what is Freakonomics. What is this thing actually? It sounds a little bit off the wall, but it's really not, right? So in a way, this is a book that came out, I think, in the late 90s, something like that. And it did something very remarkable, to be honest with you. So economists, I don't know how many of those folks you know. I know actually a fair bit still. Those people are basically nerds, right? So that they're not, you don't hear about economics too much at all. Most people don't even understand what economists actually do. And yet, believe it or not, pretty much everything that you do in your day-to-day life is probably being studied by an economist somewhere, and probably is being determined by the policies and recommendations that are being set by those economists. So it's a sort of hidden thing, but a very powerful thing that actually drives modern life, economics. But again, it's like typically very nerdy people that are sitting in the back room somewhere and often just like occasionally talk to other people. So hardly anyone in the mainstream understands what these people do. So to me, this book Freakonomics was like an awesome moment, right? And this is like finally two economists, Levitt and Dubner, that sort of wake up the rest of the world as to what is it that economists do actually, right? And how does it actually pertain to people's day-to-day lives? And basically what the book Freakonomics does is that it applies economic theory to situations that we can all relate to. Right? So it's taking a look at questions that everybody can, like a common person that has no economic background whatsoever, can relate to, and explaining those phenomena in economic terms. So that is really what the book Freakonomics is about. And actually, I believe these folks, these two gentlemen, obviously did a whole bunch of lectures, including at Microsoft, I'm proud to say, some years ago. And I believe they also have some kind of screencast for a little while, right, where they went beyond what's in the Freakonomics book, and it's still a bestseller. I go on Amazon and I'm just amazed that here's these two people that wrote this book some time ago, and it still sells so well. And obviously, it makes me a little bit sad. Also, it's like, okay, it's only these two people that bothered to do this, on behalf of all the probably hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of economists out there that do their work, on a day-to-day basis. So that is what Freakonomics is. If you take a look at the book, if you haven't read it yet, I highly recommend it. I think it will be an eye-opener. It'll help you understand quite a few things in modern life, I think. But this was actually the book that inspired me to develop this talk. And in fact, believe it or not, when I first entered the industry, the computing industry, ultimately when I graduated, I had a dual major in economics and computer science. And obviously, in my career, I sort of have not directly dealt with economics. Pretty much I've been in computing for the most part. But basically, believe it or not, when I looked at computing from the very start, I never left the economist part behind. So, in fact, what I was doing is exactly what a good economist would do, and what Levitt and Dubner have demonstrated in the book is basically looking at what I'm witnessing from an economic standpoint. Right? And in fact, some years later, I was like, oh, I put two and two together. Well, I'm thinking along these lines. These are the things that I'm thinking about, and these are the things that drive me. Well, why don't I actually deliver a talk on this, the same way Levitt and Dubner did, and try to explain to other folks, hey, why is this stuff important, and why am I looking at this from this particular perspective? So hopefully, I get to do a little bit of Freakonomics, in this talk today. Okay, so now let's sort of dive into it and get into the fundamentals of what is it that I'm talking about in all this. So just like economics, if you really begin to look at our modern world, what you will notice is that open standards and standards in general are basically everywhere, right? Whether it's like the door that you're shutting and opening, the lock and key that you're using, the car that you're getting into, the food you're having at home, and obviously a bunch of things in computing actually are all driven by standards of some sort, right? In particular, in the tech industry and any engineering related field, tons of standards, right? There's hardly anything you will do that is not based on some kind of standard-based effort somewhere, particularly in the modern world. Maybe in an agrarian society, that wouldn't be so true, but in the modern world that we live in, standards are everywhere. When you begin to look, you understand, like, hey, just acronyms jumping back at you as to how many things are driven by open standards. So the question is, why are they so pervasive, right? And I think very few people, although the tech industry is so almost so dependent on open standards, but nobody really understands why. Right? Very few people bother to take the time to ask themselves that question of why that is. Right? What is it that about things like open standards and specifications that are so important? And believe it or not, there's several reasons. Right? There's when you categorize the literature on open standards, there's a number of reasons why that is. Right? In fact, I won't be going into all of them. I'll briefly, in this particular slide, talk a little bit of them, few of them. I'll touch upon these. You'll need to understand some of these as we go into the talk a bit more. But fundamentally, I'll really be talking about one aspect of it, believe it or not, one aspect of why open standards matter. So let's go over them real quick. Okay, so first of all is interoperability. Right? When you have things that are components, and pretty much everything in modern life is broken down into components. When you need components to work together, and when you need components from different manufacturers, different providers to work together, they need to speak a common language. They need a common interface. And often this is what an open standard actually is that common interface that allows for interoperability. One thing to work with another. USB is a great example of that, for example, right? So it's because of USB that you can plug in all of those devices by many different providers into your computer, and things just work. Another one is compatibility and portability, right? So this is, again, is more along the lines of a relationship between a provider and a consumer, okay? So portability and compatibility, what that actually means is even though something is coming from two different providers, they will fundamentally be interchangeable, meaning you can use one or the other without you as a customer paying an additional cost, a switching cost for doing that. That's the idea behind it. And again, many different situations where this applies. Very obvious example. If you go to the gas station in the United States or in Europe, and frankly anywhere in the world, you will see that there's different grades of gas. Right? So there's a particular grade of gas that your car will take for the most part, and your vehicle will function in a certain way given that particular type of gas. Well, those types of petroleum, type of fuel, actually are determined by standards, right? This is why when you go from one gas station to another, you can still count on those same types of gas being there, right? So you can switch between one gas station to the other without too much trouble. right? And that is also an example of compatibility and portability. Obviously, in our industry, this is a very important thing, right? So if you don't want to be locked into a particular vendor, and you're depending on the vendor to provide you something very, very important, well, if that thing is based on open standards, that means that you can switch vendors very easily. Whereas if that's not the case, then you wouldn't be able to switch vendors at all. You'd just be locked into that. And if you wanted to switch, well, you better pay a large cost or a large tax for that. Similar type of idea is a reliable baseline quality of service. For example, when you go to buy meat in the supermarket, what you'll say is that what you'll see is that meat is graded. That you'll say like USDA class 1, or this is the type of meat you're purchasing. So this is basically telling you what quality of service can I expect from a certain thing, because it conforms to a particular standard. Okay. Again, same thing can be applied in terms of Jakarta EE profiles. Okay, so different profiles basically are communicating different levels of quality of service, right? So if you want the core profile, that means you only want a certain type of you only want to depend on a certain type of APIs, and your expectations of compatibility is a certain way. If you pick the full profile, the web profile, you have different expectations. So that's what means baseline quality of service, and that is what standards define across implementations and across providers. The other thing to understand is open standards are essentially define a core for a broad ecosystem. So I'll explain this a little bit more, and this is actually somewhat correlated with the rest of the talk that we'll talk about, but it's an important point to understand. When you have something that is so fundamentally important that many other things build upon it, okay, then that very core thing, if that is very proprietary and only comes from one source, well, it's a very risky ecosystem, right? So if something happens to that particular source, or that source decides to make a radical change in direction, well, guess what? That has a potentially very drastic impact on all of the things built on top of it, the entire ecosystem. A good example is slightly political example, but Soviet Union, right? So unlike the Western Bloc that actually decided to remain pretty much autonomous, what happened in the Eastern Bloc is that a whole bunch of economies were very tied to the former Soviet Union. So when the Soviet Union collapsed, what happened? All of those countries that used to depend on the Soviet Union for all kinds of things, including food supply, well, all of those economies also came crashing down with the Soviet Union. So basically, it's a single, that entire ecosystem was based on a single point of failure. So this is what open standards are supposed to do, because of those other reasons that we already talked about: interoperability, compatibility, reliable baseline quality of service. Fundamentally, what that means is you are relying on a set of contracts rather than a specific source. Okay, so if the source were to change, one source were to change, well, you can fall back on another provider that hopefully will provide you that same thing. And obviously, we talked about, I think people in our industry understand these things much better. So maximize vendor and implementation neutrality means that it's not just a particular vendor or a particular implementation that you're dependent upon. It's really just a standard that is based on it, and minimizing lock-in risks by doing that. Finally, we'll also touch upon this in a moment as well. So this is corollaries in the main thing that we'll talk about. But basically, when you do not have open standards, what you tend to have is hyper competition. So things that are different for really no good reason. Right? It's like baby formula is baby formula, right? The basic ingredients of baby formula is basically the same thing. But if you didn't have FDA standards that regulate what exactly baby formula is, what you'd have is like many different types of baby formula, and you as a consumer, would be very difficult for you to determine, okay, what is a good baby formula? So standardization reduces this unnecessary fragmentation, right? So it doesn't seek to eliminate fragmentation in some way, but it reduces unnecessary fragmentation. Okay, and obviously, sort of consumers and producers have to determine what is necessary fragmentation and what is unnecessary fragmentation. Finally, we'll talk about this in much greater detail. So I will not be sort of talking about this too much here. But actually, open standards have a very important role in maintaining healthy competitive ecosystems. Right. So this is actually the main point that I'll be talking about more than anything else. So all of those other points sort of are interrelated, obviously, and I'll touch upon. It's without understanding those points, it's difficult to translate some of the other things. But main thing we'll be driving at in this particular talk is going to be this last point, which is maintaining healthy competitive ecosystems. So I'm going to pause here for a little bit and check to see if you have any questions or not, and you'll see the funky mirror in mirror screen for a little bit. But let me just check for a moment, see if you have any questions or comments so far, and also, also if you don't have comments or questions yet, you could ask them now. So we'll pause just a little bit and see if you have any. Okay, I don't see anything, so I'm going to continue moving forward. And hopefully, bear that in mind, that you don't have to hold questions until the very end. You could ask me questions at any point in time. Okay, so next question we should ask is, okay, do economists really care about open standards? And the answer is obviously yes. Right? So again, pretty much every facet of modern life, believe me when I tell you, there is an economist behind it somewhere, right? That you probably don't know that person, and you'll never meet them, but actually they are helping determine a lot of the direction behind that, whatever aspect of life that you actually are utilizing or experiencing right at this moment. So there's a lot of research work on why open standards are important. I've shared with you some important some of the important links here. They basically mirror all of some of the things that I just mentioned, but actually a lot more. And in particular, the point that I'm about to the information that I'm about to share with you, none of this is actually that ill understood. When you talk to if you have an economist friend and you talk to these things about them, they'll tell you, oh yeah, I get that, right? Because there's a whole body of things that deal with just these things. So if you're curious to dig into any more of those and sort of my talk piques your interest, I'm sharing these resources ahead of time, if you will. So these are the kind of things that you can take a look at. And basically, I'm giving you almost a Cliff's Notes version of some of these things that are already out there. Okay, moving forward. Okay, so believe it or not, you just need to understand one thing, literally one economic concept of all the probably dozens of economic concepts that apply to this particular thing. There's only one thing that you need to understand in order to understand the main crux of our talk today. And that is something called the network effect. Okay, so if you understand the network effect well and understand the dynamics behind the network effect, you'll understand the rest of this talk, no problem whatsoever. So let me try to do a good job of explaining what the network effect is. So imagine for a moment that you live in a world where telephones don't exist, okay? And then suddenly telephones were invented, right? So this is probably in our societies going back hundreds of years. But let's imagine that moment for a moment, for a bit. And let's say imagine telephones were a new thing, okay? And landlines were a new thing, I should say. Okay, so we're talking about landline telephones here, which some maybe in a few years is going to be a dinosaur, but it's useful. And actually, the fundamental, I'll explain to you why I'm using this particular analogy. This actually it's not coincidental. So let's assume now that you got this new thing called the telephone, and the only users of this telephone is you and your brother-in-law. Okay, so you have a landline running between your two homes, and you have a telephone on either side. Okay, and that's about it. That is one network. Okay. Now, let's imagine that your township or your neighborhood got the bright idea. Hey, there's this new thing called a telephone, and we're smart people. Like let's why don't we take advantage of this thing? So what we will do is connect every single house in our neighborhood or in our township to each other, okay, with telephones, and literally run wires, across, in this diagram. As you can see, every phone is connected to the other phone in one way. At least there's one connection, and then you're interconnected in your neighborhood, with this network. Okay. Now you and your brother-in-law have a choice, right? You can either continue to use your own private network, or you could, ditch that and use the public one. And by the way, you have to pay a little bit more, right? Because this is a township phone system, and the costs have to come from somewhere, right? And so you all pitch in into a little bit. And by the way, your private network was basically free, right? You just installed it, but you can use it, right? You can use it only between one person, only between two people. So the township one, you can call everybody in the township, but you have to pay a little bit of money, right? So just to pay for expenses and upkeep of this little township phone system. Now let's imagine there is somebody with a lot of money, okay, a lot of capital, that determines, hey, this is a pretty good money-making scheme. So I'm going to invest in interconnecting a very large network that is statewide, or maybe even countrywide if you live in a small country, countrywide, and I'm going to connect every single house that I can in a network, and I'm going to charge a pretty hefty sum because I'm the only person that can do this. I'm going to charge a pretty hefty sum to provide this service. Okay, so here's the problem. You as a consumer, you now have another choice. So which choice are you probably going to make, right? As an average consumer, what value, what is the best value you will get overall, okay, between these three networks, right? These three competing networks, if you will, right? They're interconnected. They're not connected with each other. These are three separate networks at this point, right? So which one are you going to pick? In all reality, you will end up picking the largest network. Okay. The reason for this is even if you are paying extra money, what is happening is that you're getting the most amount of value out of that, and the more people that join that network, the larger the network is, actually the more valuable it is to you. Right? So a network that is global, okay, that can connect to every single phone in the world, well, that is the one that you're going to get, even if it actually costs a little bit more, because ultimately you're going to get more value out of that. So the bigger the net, this is a particular type. There's particular types of services, particular types of things in the modern world where the more people use a thing, the greater the utility, right? So the unit cost, the unit value of the thing may be the same, but the more consumers, the more users, the more people that use this particular thing, the bigger the value of the more valuable it actually becomes to a given individual. This is what is called the network effect. Okay, and the network effect is a very powerful force. It determines quite a few things, in our world, and whether we realize it or not, we often pick things not based on their individual merit, but often because of this network effect, for the simple fact that many other people are using this very same thing, and I can, it's inherently valuable for me to use that thing that many other people are using. So when this happens, when you have something that is subjected to strong network effects, fundamentally there's really only two outcomes. You can think this through, but ultimately there's only two outcomes. You will either have an open standard, okay, or you will have a de facto standard, right? Because the market is ultimately going to be dominated by a single thing of some kind. Now, ultimately, it's up to all of us to determine whether that thing of some kind comes from a single source or multiple sources. That is fundamentally the difference between an open standard and a de facto standard. Things like programming languages, the type of frameworks that we use in the ecosystem, this is actually all very subject to very powerful forces of network effects. So ultimately, even though in the short term there may be some level of competition, there'll always be there will almost inevitably be dominant players because of this, because of the fact that a network effect, fundamentally there's a network effect in place. So this is another thing that most people really don't understand that much in our industry, as to when you're talking about, standards, if you will. There are two different types of standards. One is a de facto standards, and the other one is an open standards, or what is also known as a de jure standard. Okay, so these are not the same thing. In fact, they're quite the opposite. Okay, and there's definitely pros and cons of these things that are very, very strong. So instead of me trying to make up the slides, I actually took a convenient slide directly from the ISO, the International Standards Organization. This is one of the largest standards-based organizations in the world. And in their literature, this is how they look at these things. Okay, so on one side, you have de facto standards, and on the other side, you have de jure standards. Okay? A de jure standard or an open standard is defined by a formal standard body of some kind, or a formal organization that provides specifications of some kind. ISO is an example, IEEE is an example, the CLES Foundation is an example, as we'll talk about in a moment. Cloud Native Foundation is an example. These are all standards bodies. They produce standards and they produce specifications. De facto standards are defined by the market. Okay, these come from individual sources, often individual companies. Okay, not organizations, not standards bodies, not specifications. Okay, these are realities of the market. Basically, you're saying somebody won. Okay, and whoever won is basically the de facto standard, the single source of provider of that particular thing. So basically, a de facto standards is a reflection of market situation. It provides some of the benefits of standardization. So when you have all those benefits of standardization that we talked about, some of them do apply to de jure standards. Okay, so they do provide some of those benefits, but it is effectively, you're saying that there is a monopoly or near monopoly. So there is a dominant player that is effectively can behave as a monopoly in that market when there is such a thing as a de facto standard. The problems with it, obviously, it's the monopoly. We'll talk about that in a moment. Why it's so problematic. There is a lack of transparency because that single source of the thing that you're using, but they don't have any obligation to open up their decision-making process to you. It's up to them how they want to provide the thing. It's entirely up to them. And ultimately, you are subjected to whatever decision-making that particular provider is making on your behalf and on their behalf. De jure standards, on the other hand, is the opposite of that, right? So often defining characteristics of open standards is that there is a due process. Okay, there's a well-defined process that ensures transparency, ensures inclusiveness, effectively, in layman's terms, ensures fair play, a level playing field for everyone, including consumers and providers of that particular thing that we're talking about. And as a result, everything is not driven by a single person's decision, but rather a specific process-driven consensus mechanism, right? So everything is actually defined and created through agreement. Okay, so some of the cons of that is, yes, it takes longer. If you're in the United States, you will know this very well. We call this so-called gridlock in the Congress. Really, what we're talking about is that people that fundamentally disagree with each other but need to come to a consensus, and that often is complex and it takes a longer time. And of course, there's a risk of non-stakeholder interference. In the case of politics, we can say essentially people that are outside of that behave in undemocratic ways in a democratic system. Far right parties and far left parties are good examples of this. This is what happened in 1930s Germany. Basically, a democratic system, the Weimar Republic, was basically taken over by the Socialist Democratic Party, aka the Nazi Party. Okay, so there is that risk always of whenever you have a consensus-driven process, somebody outside of that process can sort of take over things, can forcibly take over things and make it no longer consensus-driven and no longer democratic. Okay, so all right. Now, the telephone example I gave you, the reason it is not a coincidence is because the entire concept of network effect and recognizing that there is a network effect in place and you need to do something about it. The government often needs to do something about it. Actually, the real life example of this came from none other than AT&T. Okay, so AT&T was in that position, right, of being the most powerful telephone company in the United States. Nobody could compete with them. They had a huge network. You'd be crazy not to get your services from AT&T, and hence AT&T essentially became the dominant player in the telecom market in the United States. A huge dependency on millions of people are depending on this one company, AT&T. This is when the U.S. government stepped in and said, "Hey, AT&T, you need to break yourself up." There was also came in telecom regulations that said, okay, telephone companies must share the network with others, right? It's not can share, but must share the network with others. And this is how we bring about competition somewhere where you have very strong network effect and very strong possibility, in fact, very strong evidence of a monopoly happening. So there's some other examples, real life examples, Standard Oil Company, US Steel. These are all essentially de facto standard, real life de facto standards because of fundamentally these network effects. Okay, and ultimately somebody needed to do something to fix these situations. I think in the technology industry, there's plenty of examples of some of these things where the government has had to step in, where it is basically a de facto standard situation. So yeah, very far from theory. These are very much in practice. Interestingly, in the United States, when liberal governments come into power for some period of time, we talk more about oligarchies and monopolies and de facto standards and these kind of things. When it's a particularly conservative government, we tend to talk about it a little bit less for obvious reasons, right? The conservative companies often tend to be actually favorable to large monopolies and oligarchies. Okay, moving forward. So just in case this wasn't obvious to you, actually, let me stop for a moment. I've been going on for a bit. I'm about to transition into more deeper dive into open standards and less so about economic theory per se. So this is a good pause point. Let me stop here for a moment and check to see if you have any questions or if you have any comments, what have you. Okay, I don't see any questions as of yet. Yeah, again, feel free to pose those questions if you want. I'm gonna just keep moving. Oh, I also did want to do a quick time check. Yeah, I think we're doing good in time. All right. So just in case you didn't know why monopolies are problematic and why, aka de facto standards are problematic, here's some reasons why. Okay, so these are, in the short term, you may be paying low cost, but in the long term, with a monopoly in place, the monopolist, the person with economic power, has every single incentive to ultimately raise the prices on you. Okay, that's why you would even seek to sort of a monopoly position anyway. Ultimately, you're not doing that for the goodness of your own heart, right? There will be higher long-term pricing. Often, if it's not in terms of physical pricing, right, literally the amount of money you pay, it will come in terms of low levels of long-term innovation and low levels of quality of service. Okay, so if you can raise prices, well, you can provide a lower quality product and you can do less work and ultimately do less innovation. Okay, so that is what tends to happen when there is monopoly power. Okay, not a monopoly necessarily, but monopoly power in play. Typically, in monopoly situations, there are fewer market choices. Okay, almost by definition. There's high entry barriers. It's going to be very difficult for a new entrant, even a very qualified and valuable entrant that has a lot to offer. It's going to be very difficult for them to break into that market because they're going to have to essentially push against, the network effect, right? And there's various anti-competitive behaviors. That often somebody that has monopoly power, in order to hold on to their monopoly power, they're going to, employ every single tactic that they can, that they can get away with. That is another sort of side effect of being a monopoly, right? Why would you give that up, right? You're going to do whatever you can, even if it's basically unethical behavior and anti-competitive behavior, to basically try to keep out, your competitor, if you will. And as we talked about, it's a high-risk monoculture system, right? So if you're really dependent on a monopoly, well, you better hope that monopoly doesn't change its mind or nothing bad happens to that monopoly, like, I don't know, maybe a bad CEO, right? And then bad leadership, and suddenly, oh, you're in trouble because you were dependent on the decision making of that particular provider that you are now locked into. Okay, so these are the perils of monopoly power. Okay, so now let's dive into a little bit of open standards and how open standards work and what mechanisms are in place to make sure that even though open standards, you can think of them sort of as a monopoly, right? In a sense, an open standard is also a single source of provider in a manner of speaking, okay? But there's many different things built into what makes it not a problem, right? Is all these processes and the characteristics that make something an open standard, okay? So first thing is, an open standards is all about process. Okay, it is about ensuring transparency and inclusion through process. So typically, an open standard that's a circle there. It's a process. Okay, so and you know how the process works and what the rules of engagement are. Many different types of people. The idea here is that anyone that is relevant can put their input into this process. Okay, so whether it's a single individual, a group of individuals, aka maybe the Jakarta EE ambassadors, or a Java user group, or a corporation. Okay, these are all the could be participants into the process, and basically they're on equal footing. These sets of people should essentially be functionally equal to each other. And then finally, what the process produces is a transparent set of artifacts, a document, if you will, that anyone can use, right? So input, openness in input, openness in the way that these things are produced, openness in what is actually produced, and that is available globally to whoever wants it. Okay, whoever needs to use it at any given point in time, that should also be open to everyone. That's the heart of what an open standard is, and why it is basically almost the opposite, diametric opposite to how a monopoly actually works. So functionally, it may look like a monopoly, but it is very much the opposite of what a monopoly actually is. Okay, so all right. So what is the process? How does the process look like? Well, we have some convenient example of that in this context. I'm literally showing you the process for Jakarta EE. Okay, it's called the JSPA. It was developed some time ago, but actually very similar to mostly very similar to the way things worked in the JCP, and actually mostly very similar to how things work in open standards organizations, like, for example, the ISO, actually, right? So there's often, a well-defined stages of the development of an open standard. So there's a proposal phase, a planning phase, a development phase, a release phase. Okay, and all of these things are they have checkpoints on them, and the checkpoint is always a review, right? So that is what guarantees transparency and guarantees a particular repeatable flow. Okay, for a given specification or a standard. All right. So process part, very, very important. All right. Typically, a specification also has also looks a certain way, right? So there's certain things that are very, very common across many different types of standards. Okay. So again, very similar to how things work. This particular one, I'm actually just referencing um, mostly the Jakarta EE standard. So a specification actually comes in threes, interestingly. I don't know if this is coincidence or not, but it comes in triads. Okay, so there is in terms of the what does an open standard produce, particularly things like something like Jakarta EE, well, it produces a specification document that you or either as a consumer or a provider can read. It's openly available. It also provides a compatibility test kit, right? So it is a set of tests that you run to self-certify to say, hey, yeah, I am actually compatible implementation of this particular standard or specification. Then you have hopefully multiple compatible implementations. Sometimes it's only one compatible implementation, but that actually doesn't matter as long as the process is open to allow for another one. That's the key part, even if there is only one compatible implementation. But often there is multiple compatible implementations. Some open standards like the JCP also mandate a reference implementation. So reference implementation is valuable as a convenience for implementers and users, actually. So you're always guaranteed at least one implementation at any given point in time, and you know who to blame, if you will, if things go wrong, right? You should look into the reference implementation to understand if there's any lack of clarity as to how things should work. In Jakarta EE, actually, we are required to have at least one compatible implementation. We don't have a reference implementation, but you can say, in effect, there is a reference implementation. Because in order for a specification to be final, there needs to be at least one compatible implementation. Now, one of the things I will caution you against, to be very careful about all of this, is do be careful of partial implementations, okay, and implementations that don't have any plans to ever become fully compatible, but there is no such thing as a partial implementation, is what I'm going to tell you. It's like when it comes to open standards, you either are compatible or you are not. That's it. It's binary. Right? There should be no such thing as a partial implementation. Similarly, I will also warn you against pseudo standards. Okay, so if something claims to be a specification or claims to be an open standard, do be very engaged and make sure that it actually is doing all of the things that an open standard is supposed to be doing. Right? So transparency, inclusion, consensus building, process, open process, these things make sure they actually are happening, right, in the thing that is purporting to be a specification or an open standard. Along those lines, you really need, none of this actually happens in a vacuum, right? Somebody needs to do all this work. Okay, so basically there's three different groups of people that are often involved in open standards. These are some kind of governance body, right? In case of Jakarta EE, that would be the Ikhlas Foundation. There should be some kind of stakeholders. These would basically be the working groups. Okay, pretty much Jakarta EE has a working group. There's a number of people that are in that working group. These are the stakeholders, and you need a community around it, right? So you also need people using and actively involved in, or at least paying attention to these standards as well. So you need all of these three things in order to have an effective open standard or effective open specification. Okay. So now let's get into a little bit. We have about 10 more minutes. I think it's just about enough time to talk a little bit about the common methodology, myths around open standards. So one big one is, oh, now we have open source, we don't need open standards anymore. Okay, open source basically solves the problem, the same problem that open standards do. Well, not really. Okay, open standards, open source solves some problems. Okay, basically it solves the problems of transparency and even not even that well. Right, it really is just giving you the possibility to fork if you can. Right? Even forking an open source project sometimes is a dicey business. So open source open source alone does not guarantee you any of these things that we really talked about. It's a step toward it. If it happens to be done very well and done almost to the point where it is actually an open standard, okay, then it's okay open source. Other than that, open source doesn't guarantee you anything. There's lots of open source things out there that use the open source label, but in reality, these are not that much different from functionally and practically speaking, they're not that much different from single vendor proprietary providers. Okay, so even though something is open source, you're going to have a very hard time getting away from that one provider of that open source thing, or even being able to guarantee any transparency or inclusion in the end. So really what you need actually is open standards and open source. And again, the Eclipse Foundation is a good example. Ultimately, it's an open source organization that happens to also be doing open standards and open specifications. So, and this is not just theory, it's practice. Okay, so when people talk about, oh, open source is all you need, when they actually begin to look at what successful things that they say is open examples of open source solving the problems of open standards, like Linux or Apache or MySQL. Well, guess what? All of those things are actually based on open standards. Okay, so the reason those are successful open source projects is actually because they are open standards. They just are very, very obvious about that, right? So ultimately, things like Linux, there's a lot of open standards behind it that make Linux distributions compatible with each other, and actually provides all of those additional benefits other than simply being open source. Same thing with Apache. It basically is nothing really much more than an implementation of a bunch of different standards, or an open source implementation of a bunch of different standards. Same thing with things like MySQL and PostgreSQL, right? They're ultimately implementing the SQL standard basically. And the same can be said of all of the different things that we talked about that are in our ecosystem as well. Frankly speaking, Java SE is an open standard. Java is an open standard. So is Jakarta EE. It's an open specification. Microprofile is an open specification. Things like JavaScript and EC, what we know as JavaScript, what really is a particular flavor of ECMA script. Well, that is also an open standard, an open specification defined by the W3C. Okay, so definitely don't let anyone tell you that all you need is open source. That's not true. You need open source and open standards in order to really counteract effectively against monopoly power and the network effect. So some other complaints from typical sources that are frankly have an anti-competitive agenda in some cases. These are the kind of complaints that they usually have. Standards are slow. It's designed by committee. Standards don't guarantee portability. Standards don't have my particular feature that I want to use XYZ. Standards don't innovate. Standards are a bunch of vendor experts, and so on and so forth. Okay, so to that, in a very polite way, let me show this slide. Okay, so tell me something in real life that is perfect. Okay, so just because it isn't perfect doesn't mean it's not serving a function, right? So if you look at your McDonald's drive-through menu, you'll see a really nice picture of how an idealized burger is supposed to look like. Okay, in reality, it doesn't look like that. Right? Most of the times, it doesn't look like that photo. That somebody took a lot of time and effort to take that photo, that perfect photo. But guess what? It's still a burger. Okay, so it's the same thing with open standards. Okay, so so are open standards perfect? They don't have any downsides whatsoever? Absolutely not. Right? There's many different things that can be improved over open standards, but it does not take away fundamentally from its core value proposition. So standards are slow, yes, they're slower than a single implementer, single company decision, because it does take time to build consensus, and it does take time to follow process. It does take time to do things the right way. All right. Is it designed by committee? Yes, it is. Right? Ultimately, it is designed by consensus. Is that necessarily a bad thing? I really don't think so. Right? So fundamentally, you do have to make a choice. When you say I don't want design by committee, really what you're saying is I want a dictatorship. Okay, so I don't think we really want that. Right? Fundamentally, no, dictatorships aren't benevolent, even if they claim to be. Okay, so design by committee ultimately means that you respect the process and you respect the consensus building mechanism, right? Even if you don't necessarily agree with it. Okay, so you're respecting the fact that you need to convince other people and you need to arrive at a consensus. It's not just a matter of, hey, it's my opinion and it must be right. That doesn't work like that. When you are talking about open standards and open specifications, standards are not designed to guarantee your portability, by the way. They enhance these things. They make these things possible. But no standard can guarantee 100% portability, because standards are not closed ecosystems. Just because something implements a standard does not mean that a given provider cannot go beyond the standard. In fact, that's how innovation actually happens, is when somebody goes beyond the standard, and that is part of the consensus building process. Is like the other people that are in the consensus building process should be able to see that, okay, even though you're not implementing the standards or you're going beyond the standards, it is actually working. So let's adopt that into the standard next time. So this is why there'll never be 100% portability guarantees. That's ultimately up to you. But it is much better than no portability whatsoever. So you will have some degree of portability, and how much is ultimately determined by how much you want to stick to the standard. But at least it is leaving that option on the table for you. Okay. Will standards have every single feature that you're looking for? It won't, right? Because ultimately you do have to agree on what is a baseline, and there'll always be things outside the baseline. And when something is a part of an ecosystem, it shouldn't contain too much bloat, because any little bit of bloat is going to have to be carried forward by every single thing that needs to depend on the standards. So standards do tend to be lean. Okay, so I would say this actually can work to the benefit of most technologies that want to remain lean also, and remain close to the KISS principle of keep it simple, stupid. If it's not a bell and whistle that you need, don't use it. Okay, so it fits in the open standards philosophy in that manner.
Hi,
Standards
Reza.
don't.
Sorry, I
Okay.
just wanted to. Hi there. So we have 2 minutes to wrap it up.
Okay. Fair enough.
Yes.
Yeah,
So
should be fine.
we just need to. Okay. We have to ask questions. If there's anything, it will cut off at 11.
Yep. Okay. Feel free to ask questions. I'll stop in a moment. They're similar. Standards don't innovate, not really accurate, right? They do innovate in some cases, but they don't over standardize. Okay, if you will. And not a bunch of vendor experts. It really hasn't been true of Java standards for a very, very long time. Okay. All right. But ultimately, the question is, if you want to make it perfect, you want to make improvements, you want to make it better. Well, that's on you, right? And the way you do that is you get involved. And the way you get involved is, well, everything is in the open. Get logged on onto Jakarta EE and find out for yourself. If you want to go beyond that, log on onto the Jakarta ambassadors, and we'll show you, right, how you can get involved and how you can make things better. So above and beyond that, I want to leave you with one final thought. Right? I'm not here to honestly preach religion to you. Right? Open standards are not a religion. They're fundamentally an engineering value. Right? So, and it is important for us to remain balanced, in our viewpoints, in my opinion. So, is open standards the end all be all? Should everything be standardized? By no means. Okay, so as I mentioned, there'll always be extensions that expand frontiers. And ultimately, it's the job of the open standard to take a look at what is working and further improve the standard. And also, there should be standards that basically should be proving grounds for innovation more than anything else. Now, also, standards and specifications guarantee against monopolies, but they do not guarantee necessarily on their own a healthy competitive ecosystem. Okay, so we do need to keep an eye out on the external to standards. They help, but they cannot guarantee this either, just like it cannot guarantee portability. So there can be cases where simply too small or too uncompetitive of a set of people are defining a set of standards and not reinvesting back into the standard and sort of doing their own thing. Right? So these are things we need to be mindful of, and through participation, make sure that it doesn't happen. Similarly, does everything need to be a standard? No, right? So so things there can be things outside the standard that push the boundaries. There can be alternative approaches. The important part is that to remain a healthy balance, right? As long as things are not so lopsided that you really just have a monopoly and the standard is sidelined, that's an unhealthy situation. I think there can be competition, but as long as open standards are at the core of it, and things that build upon that other things that are in the ecosystem are sort of building upon, or at least in the neighborhood of those open standards. So at the end of the day, it is really ultimately all up to you. So this is, I hope, the one thing that you take away from here is that these things actually matter. Right? Things like Jakarta EE, things like open standards, these are important to you as an individual. And ultimately, it is up to you to make sure these remain healthy. And the way you do that is you engage, you participate. All right, so that's about it. I think I'm really just about at time now. I'm going to stop sharing, and maybe in the last few minutes or so, we can take some questions.
Yes, so we do have one question from Tito Sanchez. Do you think standards help you to reduce the risk investing in technologies in the long term?
Absolutely, yeah. So they reduce risk in many different ways, and if you look back into the presentation, you'll see the many different ways that it does that. Right. The primary way that it does it is that it guarantees vendor neutrality. It guarantees that the thing that you are depending on in your application is not just dominated and provided by one single entity. It's provided by many different people, and you as a consumer have the ability to switch between those providers.
Amazing. And just for anybody that is interested, Reza did provide his slides for today's presentation. There is a link there. And it doesn't look like there's any other questions. So we are good to go. Thank you so much, Reza, for today's presentation. It was very informative. And if anybody in the audience has any questions, you could feel free to continue putting them in the chat, and I can share them with Reza via email alongside your credentials.
Yep. So speaking of which, I posted my contact in the chat as well.
Amazing. That is
get in
perfect.
touch with
Thank
me.
you so much.
Very
Reza.
easy thing to do.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I hope everyone has a wonderful day, and thank you again. Take care.